Ladies and gentlemen, welcome everybody. Welcome and good evening. Welcome to Policy Exchange, and to this, the most recent in our series of policy fight clubs. As some of you know who have been here before, these are our opportunity to talk about some of the big controversial issues that we don't always get to look at directly in our normal research, but unquestionably affect all the different issues that we look at here at Policy Exchange. Policy Exchange, as you know, we always pride ourselves on being very timely and topical in the discussions that we have. Even our giant-brained research gnomes could never have predicted that we would meet this evening in the middle of the great Euro crisis, and only a few weeks after the big vote in Parliament. So, this evening follows a very traditional format. We're going to start with speakers, proposers and opposers for 5 minutes each at the start of the discussion, and then we will open out into a wider debate. We have an absolutely stellar cast of people to open up our discussion this evening. For the motion, it's time for the UK to leave the EU. We have Douglas Carswell, who is the MP for Clacton and a leading campaigner for direct democracy. We have Peter Hitchens, who is a columnist for the Mail on Sunday, and the only veteran so far of one of our previous policy fight clubs. We also have Matthew Sinclair, director of the Taxpayers Alliance, and the author of the recent best-selling book, Let Them Eat Carbon. Opposing the motion, on my right-hand side, saying it's not time for the UK to leave the EU, we'll start with Dominic Raab, who's the MP for Esher and Walton. He's a leading light from the new intake, and was in fact given the Newcomer of the Year award at the Spectator Parliamentarian of the Year Awards last year. Spot in the room there. We then have Anthony Browne, who's the former Brussels correspondent of the Times. He's also, of course, the former director of Policy Exchange. So a huge pleasure to have you back here. Anthony's also the author of the recent paper, The Case for European Localism, so very involved in this debate. As is Roland, last but not leastly, who is founding partner of Business for New Europe, the pro-European campaign group, and founding partner of Finsbury. Each of them will have 5 minutes to make their case at the very start. This is a debate, so if you do want to interrupt, if you want to make a point of information or to question something that's been said, put your hand up. Our speakers may not choose to take your point, but they may also, on the other hand, choose to take it. Each of you will have just 5 minutes at the start. Any attempt to overrun that will be dealt with brutally, medievally, and in ways which are absolutely not compatible with the ECHR. So, we will have a vote at the start as well to see if any of you change your minds during the course of the discussion. We will also be videoing this discussion, so we'll know how you all voted, see if you change your mind. So, to begin the discussion, not all of you, I'm conscious, have our wonderful high technology voting cards, but we will ask for a show of hands. So, to see how the room breaks at the start of the discussion, I'm going to ask all of you, those of you who are in favour of the motion and in favour of the idea that Britain should now leave the European Union, if you can put up your green cards or put up your arms if you don't have green cards, and if you keep them up, I will do a count. So here are the antis. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. 21 for the motion, and all those against the motion, those who don't want to leave. A few more of you, I think. Looks like there's more of you in the room. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27. I make it 42, so 21, 42. That's exactly at the start of the debate. Even with my bad maths, I can tell there's 2 to 1 in favour of staying in so far. And perhaps to change that, we'll first have 5 minutes from Douglas Carswell. Over to you, Douglas. Thank you for coming this evening.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I will attempt to say in 4 minutes what I think too few politicians have been prepared to argue over the past 40 years, which is that the United Kingdom should withdraw from the European Union. I think that the first reason why we need to withdraw from the European Union is raw economics. It is not in our economic interest to remain part of the European Union. When we joined in the early 1970s, we joined a part of the world that at that time accounted for 36% of global GDP. We thought we were joining a prosperous trade bloc. By 2020, those countries that constitute the original EU will amount to 15% of global GDP. We thought we were joining a prosperous trading bloc, and we've shackled ourselves instead to a corpse. The price of EU membership, I don't think, is worth paying. Our gross contribution is £19.4 billion last year. Our net contribution is 9.2. Now, some people would say we should look at the net figure rather than the gross figure. But those of you who work for think tanks, I'm sure would think it was rather absurd if the government tried to persuade you that, overall, you were a gross non-taxpayer, because despite paying 20p in the pound, you were getting all those goods and services back in return. But even if you take the lower figure, the net figure, if we were to spend that money in this country, we could give people a 70% cut in council tax. We could alternatively scrap inheritance tax, capital gains tax, and take a penny off income tax. I think that it would be better for us to spend that money doing that than paying to subsidise people like Baroness Ashton to arrange our affairs for us. By being part of the EU, we've become liable for £12.2 billion worth of bailouts for a currency we chose not even to join. We have shut ourselves into a small sclerotic part of the world where we do more trade with Belgium than we do with the rising powers of India and China. I think that is the problem, rather than a reason for us to stay in the European Union. Look at what it's done to our politics. It has diminished the power for us to elect a government who will change our affairs. Most of regulations and laws that affect us are now made by the European Union. It has diminished our democracy. It makes it impossible to deliver the sort of localism that Anthony will tell us about. Now, Anthony and Dominic and Roland, who are good, honest, decent people, believe that, I'm sure, we should change the European Union. Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, for all their talk of reform, there is only one type of European Union on offer, and it is not interested in devolving power down to this country. It's not interested in the localist agenda that the centre-right believes in. If we remain part of the European Union, we have to accept the jurisdiction of foreign courts. We cannot, unfortunately, deliver the sort of reforms that they will suggest we need. Ultimately, I think we should reject membership of the European Union not because of flags or grand design or cultural identity. Ultimately, we should reject it because I think it is wrong to try to arrange a continent of millions of people by grand design. By designing Europe by grand design, we have created a fisheries policy with no fish, an agricultural policy that is not in the interest of our farmers, a system of red tape that stifles innovation and small businesses. And look at what it's done to the European single currency. Instead, I think we should come out and we should have an in-out referendum. I hope that all members of this panel, all 6 of us, whether you believe passionately in staying in, or like me, you think we should come out, should recognise that ultimately the vote that counts is not the show of hands tonight. It should be for every single adult in this country, ultimately, to decide whether we remain in. We have left it to ministers and mandarins to decide this question for too long, and look at the mess they've made of it. Bad deal after hopeless deal. Dreadful negotiation after dreadful negotiation. The only way we can get what we want, I think, is to trust the people. So I support coming out. I support having a referendum so that the people, not the Westminster elite, the Westminster village, ultimately decides. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dominic.
Well, first of all, thank you, Neil. This is my first introduction to Fight Club, and I love the film. I seem to recall that Ted Moulton was delusional and Brad Pitt was a figment of his imagination. So I'm not quite sure which side I'm on here, but it seems to be an apt format for a debate on the EU. Nearly all of my colleagues, Conservative colleagues in the House of Commons, support repatriation of powers, whether it's through renegotiation or, as Douglas has said, through withdrawal. But the practical economic differences between, say, a menu of opt-outs, repatriation of whole areas of competence, withdrawal but a Norwegian-style relationship, or even going even further and having a Swiss-style relationship, the implications of each of those are far less clear in empirical terms than any of their respective advocates imply. And I think our analysis at the same time also needs to take a far more dynamic look at the future, not just a static snapshot at the pros and cons we have now. But just to give you one example, and on this I agree with Douglas, on Treasury figures, UK exports to the EU compared to the rest of the world went from being over half to the EU in 2000 to over half to the rest of the world today. That trend almost certainly will continue. For now, nonetheless, the EU remains the single largest UK export market. But Europe faces, in my view, long-term decline. It may well become ever more protectionist. It may well become even more over-regulated. And I certainly make common cause that our economy shouldn't be shackled to or by that very stagnant model, which is, I think, where the EU is headed. One answer is to try and immunise the British economy from this sort of sclerotic social and employment regulation, but to try and do it from within the EU. Another is to try and stay part of the single market, but reclaim the authority to negotiate free trade deals in our own right. EU lawyers, and I used to be one, hate the idea that we can be part of a customs union and negotiate our own free trade deals, because that would mean that their precious EU rules of origin would apply to UK-EU trade, but not other imports into Britain. But that kind of entrepot status is not only workable, just look at Turkey, but also, I think, well suited to Britain's interests in a globalised century. To my mind, that kind of economic model would be the optimum for Britain, along with the full right to opt in or out of other areas, whether it's justice and home affairs, foreign policy, and the rest. Now, you'll hear very eloquently today's withdrawal. You've heard from Douglas and from the other two. I might even be persuaded one day, but not right now, as this motion asks, because there is a real danger that if we got the referendum on withdrawal today, we would lose it. If you ask all the business groups, and I've been in touch with them, CBI, IOD, FSB, BCC, not one supports withdrawal, not one. Now, under the glare of a referendum campaign at a time of economic uncertainty, that might well prove a decisive voice. For the same reason, I wouldn't want a 3-question referendum right now, as we had proposed in the EU debate recently, because I think it would split the repatriation vote. Now, on the other hand of this debate, you've got those who say that seeking renegotiation, those supporting that are in cloud cuckoo land, because our European partners will never accept any special status for Britain. I'm not sure about that. I think there is quite a lot in the shifting tides to suggest we might be able to get concessions. Whether there be enough is another matter. But I'm not defeatist about our prospects for renegotiation. But I am sure that the country needs to see us try to renegotiate before it would accept the case withdrawal. And I think if you look at some of the polling, in particular the Comrades poll last month, it bears this out. So that's really why I would support a referendum sandwich, which is what I'm calling it. I think you need a referendum to provide a clear mandate for renegotiation under the shadow of a second referendum after that renegotiation that would then offer the public the renegotiated deal or then the alternative of withdrawal. That is the way to get taken seriously in Brussels. That is the way to carry the British public. I attended a seminar with Commission officials, including the President, earlier this month, and I asked them all, if the choice was a renegotiated relationship or withdrawal, what would Europe say then? Now, I'm afraid the seminar was Chatham House rules, but I will tell you, that is the stark choice they fear. That's the ultimatum or the zero-sum choice that they fear. And that's also how we maximise our leverage in any renegotiation. So, ladies and gentlemen, we do need leadership on this issue now more than ever. We can debate the pros and cons of withdrawal from the EU, but the country is not there yet. That is a fact, and it first needs to know there's no alternative, and that's why I'm afraid it is not yet time for the UK to withdraw from the EU.
Thank you. Matthew, over to you.
Well, Dominic was worried about a fight club because he thought it might be a figment of our imagination. I was more worried about a fight club with an MP who's also a martial arts champion. But he talks here about, I want to start off on the business groups who all support this, the CBI, the IOD, etc. Because I think there's a clear divide here between the lobbyists and the workers in these businesses, between the politicians and the people. I went once to one city firm and we spoke with a trader who was absolutely panicking about the disastrous dysfunction of EU policy. We then went upstairs to speak to the head of government affairs, who gave us the same standard complacency. I think the truth is, most people working in most businesses do not know what their lobbyists do on their behalf. Most of the PR industry is a complete rip-off. And I think therefore use a lobbyist with a severe pinch of salt. Now, the first thing I think it's important to set out here is neither side here is going to make Britain an island any more than it is now. In both cases, Britain will continue to be able to trade with the European Union. Under any case, there is no country in the world that cannot, to some extent, trade with in the European Union unless it doesn't want to. At the same time, there will still continue to be areas where we agree and discuss policy. And again, there is no country in the world that does not engage in some way in policy-making discussions with the European Union. The question is, do we want that relationship to be that of being part of a project with the goal of ever closer union, with the implicit goal, with the kind of spending, taxation powers it has, with the ability to take and waste our money on the scale it does, and regulate our business to the extent it does? Or do we want a relationship which is essentially one of a trade deal? Now, Dominic suggested he's essentially, he would be very amenable to that. In fact, his main case against this seemed to be that his case against leaving the EU is that we might fail to leave the EU. So I don't think we're in too much of a fight at this. And look at it. I mean, I'm going to trust this. Can we achieve a different relationship while still having fairly good trade? I'm going to look at the Swiss. So they think that their current relationship is about maintaining the EU costs about half a billion. That if they were to move up to the EEA style, a slightly tighter relationship, it moves to about $750 million. The EU, 3.4 billion net, gross nearly 5 billion. This is very careful accountants in Switzerland saying that there is a big difference and that this isn't some factum option where we lose our ability to decide on the same regulations. We would gain a very significant power to decide our own regulation. And that's why we would also lose power that we wouldn't have all those billions that Douglas talks about being spent on a £250,000 shower for Sarkozy that he never used and was then torn out after the EU referendum was complete, after the EU summit was complete. We wouldn't see billions wasted every year of our money on a fisheries policy which has destroyed Britain's fishing industry. We wouldn't be put in this constant situation because in the end, the biggest reason to reject the EU is it's an extremely bad way of making policy. If you're a practical policy type, it's a really bad way of doing it. Firstly, because it's inflexible. Biofuels policy is hated by everyone from me to Friends of the Earth. And yet, when the commissioner is asked, why can we not scrap this? She says, well, because if we change this policy, we have to change all the others. That structure of decision making is very bad at changing its course, at adjusting, at forming. At the same time, now we'll have, this is all, at the same time, it's very prone to ugly majoritarianism. From the fishing policy to the Tobin tax, this is an institution because you don't have those common bonds of loyalty, because you don't have a demos here, which will always tempt to destroy the interest of a distinctive country like the EU in the favour of the continental norm. And finally, because it's undemocratic. Because there's a reason why we oppose taxation without representation, the reason why the Americans wanted to set that principle. Because the only fundamental guard against a dismal waste of money continuing forever is that the people who pay, the great mass of people who always pick up the bill, are able to say no. Until we lose that, we won't have better, more efficient government. But I wasn't always, we'll have here the case, well, it'll be reformed. Wait a second. I used to believe it. There's still an article up somewhere on the internet from me saying we shouldn't leave the European Union because the process of enlargement will have meant that there's a larger looser Europe is gaining ground. And then we had Lisbon. And then we had the Eurozone crisis, surely the ultimate testament to this politics of centralisation being economically disastrous. And now we're getting fiscal union. And we're getting a government that claims to be Eurosceptic, saying fiscal union will save the Eurozone. Every crisis ends in the call for more centralisation. Every crisis of centralisation leads to a drive for more of it. A two-speed Europe may be within our grasp, but the speeds may be different, the direction will be the same. Any repatch, we may be able to go claw back some minor part of labour market policy, which only matters to business and to a few big businesses and their lobbyists. We won't get back the power to govern ourselves across large areas of policy. We won't get back the ability to have a democratic debate on some of the biggest regulatory and fiscal matters facing our country. Until the only way we can do that is with, and we can discuss the timing, we can discuss the political strategy, but let's at least have it clear in our own mind that a policy which is substantively leaving, moving towards a kind of relationship somewhere like Norway, Iceland or Switzerland, I know there's differences there, but that kind of relationship has to be the direction we are looking to move in. That is leaving, and let's at least have that clear in our own minds. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Over to you, Roland.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, 30 years ago, Henry Kissinger posed his question, who do I call when I want to talk to Europe? And I'm afraid it's as pertinent as ever today. And those of us on this side have to accept there has been an abject lack of leadership, and we are, as the opponents have said, or proponents of the motion have said, in a Eurozone crisis. But none of that should obscure the fact that we have huge benefits from the European Union. And for me, the most obvious one is the single market. Here we have 500 million people, 27 countries, one set of rules and regulations. It's calculated that it's worth 600 billion a year to Britain alone. And we have really Margaret Thatcher to thank for that, because in 1986 she signed the Single European Act. It was the greatest pooling of sovereignty that any British Prime Minister was willing to do, and for this she was absolutely right in this matter. And I think when one looks at that across the globe, it's been said that the European Union's a corpse. Well, it's an incredibly important one to us, because when it comes to our trade, 50% with the European Union, we can get very excited about the BRICS, and we should be trading more in India and China. But the fact is we export more to Ireland than we do to China, to India and Brazil altogether. So of course we want to export more there, but we must realise that this is the heart of where our trade is today. Why would we turn our back on the decision-making process that's going on there now when it's so important to us? And two other very quick points. There are things the European Union can do as 27 nations that we can't do on our own. Just take the setting up free trade agreements. Quite recently, the European Union set one up for South Korea. We tried for a long time in bilaterals. It hasn't worked, but it did as part of the European Union. It's worth $500 million a year to us. But they're now looking at doing one with Canada. They're going to set up ones with countries in South America, and hopefully with India. And you don't have to take my word for it. Kamal Nath, the former trade minister, made it very clear. He said he would always talk to any British trade minister any time. But if we thought that was the equivalent of talking to the Trade Commissioner for 27 countries, representing 500 million people, we were delusional. And I think he was utterly right. And secondly, in energy security, Russia has been extremely able at picking off one by one European Union countries to do separate deals. And finally, beginning of this year, the whole 27 nations agreed to negotiate as one. And we negotiated a new gas deal with Azerbaijan, and the gas running through the Nabucco pipeline, which is partly funded by the European Union, in terms of making sure we're not as reliant on Russia as we would be without that deal. And that's incredibly important. And we couldn't have done that alone. We had to do it as part of the European Union. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we come back to the crisis today. Because there's a Eurozone crisis, because there has been a lack of leadership, is it right now to turn our backs and leave? And of course, there is an alternative. We can emulate Norway. We can be part of EFTA. And right now, in the Council of Ministers, there are negotiations going on about offshore oil and gas. It has a huge ramification for Norway. But when that decision-making process is finished, Norway will implement those regulations, no ifs, no buts, no questions. They will implement them in full. And they pay 400 million a year for the privilege of doing that. We at the moment have a say. And of course, the Bruges Group actually estimated that it would cost us 3.9 billion a year to be part of EFTA, where we'd have no say, where we would implement what we were told to do, when we're told, and how we're told to do it. So I say, ladies and gentlemen, it's much better to be part of the debate, to try and shape our future. Let's stick with it, and let's continue to fight for the open and liberal Europe Britain has always believed in. Thank you.
Peter, over to you.
Thank you. They told us the other day that Europa spricht Deutsch. I thought maybe the other side would be conducting their part of the debate in German. Maybe they're just thinking it. Certainly they're thinking in something alien to the English language. I must first of all deal with this constant metaphor of the two-speed Europe, presented to us as if there were two trains, one gleaming a train from the Deutsche Bundesbahn full of restaurant cars and comfortable seats and white pillows and stewards bringing you things, and the other rickety old network rail job emitting clouds of black smoke into the sky and going nowhere. No, the two speeds are much more comparable to one of those environmental lavatories we now find. You can press one button and you go down the plumbing very fast, and you can press the other one and you go down more slowly. Those are the offers to us. Let us deal very briefly with some of the rubbish put forward by the proponents of remaining. Repatriation of powers is fantasy. The principle and purpose of the European Union is l'union de plus en plus étroite, ever closer union, as it's often translated, actually ever narrower union. That is its point. The acquis communautaire forbids anybody from getting anything back they've given to it, and you can't do it, it's a ratchet. The idea that you can should surely have been beaten out of anybody who's been observing the European Union and its way of treating its subject countries over the past several decades. There is no repatriation available. Don't listen to a word anybody says you speak to it. It is fantasy. The export market. Well, yes, because the European Union buys so much, because we sell, because the European Union buys so much from us, that somehow or other, by some mysterious process, if we leave the European Union, they're going to stop selling us all those things. So, because we leave the European Union, they're going to destroy their own export market by saying no and defy the rules of the World Trade Organization. Why is this fantasy so regularly repeated? How stupid do they think we are? It is not going to happen. In terms of negotiation, in terms of powers that we have over the European Union, Mexico has a far superior trading relation to the European Union to ours. And it is not required to attend endless summits and meetings in Brussels to obtain this, nor does it confuse itself with the delusion that somehow or other by attending these meetings it influences decisions which have already been taken by Germany and France and in which nobody else has any serious say. That is the European Union. That is what it is. Now, one other thing I want to say quickly at this stage. My side of this argument has been defamed, insulted, and generally misrepresented by the other side year upon year upon year upon year. Little Englanders, anti-Europeans, xenophobes. Ladies and gentlemen, I love the European continent. I've loved it ever since I first visited it. I go there as often as I possibly can. I have lived for more than 2 years on it. And the idea that I have anything against foreign countries is completely fantastic. The idea that any of us do so is fantastic. And yet the other side resort ceaselessly to this nonsense. Why do they resort to it? Because they know that fundamentally they don't have any real arguments. And therefore the ad hominem and the smear is more effective. There's one other thing that I would say. I don't myself believe in referenda. I think they're a nasty trick used by governments to manipulate populations into doing what they want to do anyway. The way in which this country will leave the European Union, and let us here dispense with Euroscepticism, a phony position which involves being rude about the European Union in opposition and grovelling to it in government. Any seriousness in politics or indeed in thought is you either wish to remain in and remain subject to this grotesque outfit, or you are in favour of secession. The only way in which this will be achieved is if the government is elected by in a general election with a parliamentary majority which is committed to the party. And one of the reasons why this doesn't happen is because of the terminal gutlessness and uselessness of the Conservative Party, which will not take this position, though most of its supporters and many of its members of Parliament know perfectly well that it is the only available choice. Until they do, a significant part of the population will believe that for some reason there is something to be scared of in leaving the European Union. Ladies and gentlemen, there is nothing to be scared of in leaving the European Union. There is much to be scared of in remaining in it. I do recommend that you vote in favour of this motion.
Very good stuff. And for our last of our opposers, Anthony Browne.
Thank you very much, Neil. And it's a great honour to be back on the Policy Exchange platform. And it's fantastic to have this innovation of Policy Flight Club. One of the great things that Neil has bought a policy exchange, as well as double glazing in this room, so you can now actually hear the debate going on. In fact, it's actually quite amazing how much policy exchange has improved since I left it. I'd just like to start with a slightly unusual proposition. I basically agree with pretty much everything that the proposers of the motion actually say, apart from two things. One is Douglas Carswell's points that I'm a decent, honest and good person, which is clearly totally untrue. And the second is actually the conclusion. I mean, clearly, there is an awful lot wrong with the EU. I mean, clearly, in many ways, it's its own worst enemy. I think it's too centralised. The decision-making process is too clunky. Clearly, the Eurozone crisis shows, big faults in one of its biggest projects, and no one can pretend that the EU is a perfect thing. But when you translate that to pulling out the EU, I just say be careful what you actually wish for. And I'm reminded slightly of a little debate I had with my 6-year-old son over the weekend, who tried to persuade me to leave the house and leave him in it by himself. He said, "I can look after myself. I don't need you here," while I was going to the shops. But imagine if I did that, and he'd soon realise that actually he needed. How much he needed me, and he couldn't actually deal with himself. No, I'm not taking. No. It's all about costs and benefits, basically. And I think the problem with the outers is they tend to overestimate the cost of being in the EU and underestimate the benefit. They tend to underestimate the benefits of being in the EU, and they don't take enough account of the costs of actually leaving the EU. And I'll allow you to interrupt someone to say which way you would have voted. You didn't vote.
He didn't vote. Yes, I'll interrupt. Can you tell us he agree with his fellow opponent in the motion that the benefit of the EU is 600 billion a year?
I think 600 billion probably is. It's probably not quite as much as that. But there are huge economic benefits to being in the EU, and the biggest one, it may not be 600 billion, but is being in the single market and being able to write the rules of the single market. And actually, I really wouldn't underestimate that. I mean, as it happens, I was with a big company this morning who were saying, whatever happens, we mustn't leave the EU because we need that single market, and to be in the single market with the set of rules that we can help influence. And there's an example of that I was quite involved with. It's the whole AFIM directive on hedge funds. And actually, Europe came up with a directive on hedge funds that was very antithetical to the UK's interest in it. We were actually at the negotiating table round there. We managed to turn the directive round and actually help create a single market for hedge funds. It was probably
you were lobbyists.
Well, I was working at City Hall, so I'm responsible for and that was a clear example where we managed to mould the rules in our favour. But there are other things that the EU has done which I think are wonderful. I mean, I was in Brussels as the Times correspondent when Eastern Europe joined, and I really, 8 countries in Eastern Europe, and I really wouldn't underestimate the importance of the EU in spreading democracy. And we have been at the lead of pushing for enlargement. It's really not clear that if we haven't been there. Sit down. If we hadn't been there, that actually enlargement would have proceeded at the pace that it did. And we shouldn't underestimate as well how important the EU was for actually entrenching democracy in those 8 Eastern European countries. Without it, a lot of them were having a big internal debate. Are they democratic, liberal, capitalist democracies, or could they go back to communism and so on, as many other former places controlled by the Soviet Union went. We have big battles, and the ones that I saw sort of firsthand when I was in Brussels, like over Microsoft. There's no way, and it's sort of abuse of monopoly of its web browser. There's no way as one country that we could have actually seeing down Microsoft. No, I'm not saying, well, why do you want to interrupt everyone? It's too interesting. Whereas Europe got together, and this is Mario Monti, who's now the undemocratically unelected Prime Minister of Italy, he managed to get a fantastic deal from Microsoft that we couldn't have done by ourselves. And it goes on and on, like mobile phone roaming charges, overseas roaming charges, etc., where we wouldn't have got the deal. The cost of leaving, we could get a trade deal if we left, and clearly we'd get a trade deal like Norway or whatever, and so on and so forth. And as it happens, I'm half Norwegian. I spend a lot of time talking to my Norwegian relatives about whether Norway should or shouldn't be in the EU. It's a very interesting debate in Norway. And actually, I really wouldn't underestimate the degree to which trade rules and the single market rules as they come up will be designed against us, as it were. There is a big protectionist tendency in Europe. There's no denying it. You see, like the financial services regulations are all coming down the track now. A lot of them are really, you know, they've been designed in a way that isn't necessarily in our interest. But because we're at the negotiating table, we can turn them around, as you know, George Osborne has been doing, and actually make sure they are in our interest. And if we weren't there at the negotiating table, we absolutely wouldn't be able to do that. And what we really should do is fight for the sort of EU we want. And this I think often is the fundamental difference between people like myself and some of them sort of more the outers, as it were. And I had this when I was in Brussels. I used to have this discussion with Daniel Hammond quite a lot. But actually, I haven't given up on the idea of reforming the EU, and I think that the outers are, I would say, sort of defeatist, and they've sort of given up way too early. I think the EU is capable of reform. It's continuously reformed. But the reason it's reformed in the direction it keeps moving is because the people, France has a very clear strategic vision of where it wants the EU to go, and it keeps pushing in that direction. And we're just not part of that debate as a country. I want a sort of open, liberal, sort of slightly more decentralised Europe that you know, I think the majority of the European population, certainly the official Conservative Party policy was. But as a country, we just haven't really been pushing in that direction very much. We're sort of inconsistent. We move in different directions. When we have big visions of what we want, like enlargement, successive governments of Britain have wanted enlargement. We've championed it. We've corralled the force in that direction, and we've got enlargement. And what we should do as a country is actually focus far more, and this is the point of my paper on European localism, is focus far more, have a far bigger strategic vision of what we want with Europe and actually pushing it. But we keep getting hung up on this idea of should we be in, should we be out, etc. And that, while we're so hung up on that issue, we just can't actually push properly for the sort of reform we want. So, I'm not sort of starry-eyed about the EU, but I'm not sort of swivel-eyed either. But I think we're far better in than out. The benefits of being in are far greater than we say. The costs of leaving are far greater than opponents praise. So I put it to the House, we should leave the EU, and I urge everyone to reject this motion.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, at this point in the discussion, it's time to turn things over to you. If you would like to make a point or to ask a question of any of our proposers or opposers, just put up your hand. If you can say who you are and where you're from, that would be even better. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions in the room. Why don't we start at the very front, Stuart Wheeler, and we'll go to the very back, gentleman right at the back.
I'm Stuart Wheeler, the Treasurer of UKIP. I thought it curious that those who are in favour of the EU spent us, or two of them did, telling us how ghastly it was. Yes. But more seriously, I'd like to zero in on the cost of our membership. Douglas Carswell pointed out how expensive our contribution was, but that is only a fraction of what it actually costs us. If you believe the Taxpayers Alliance, that figure is 130 billion, not million, billion pounds a year, which is more than 3/4 of our deficit, incidentally. But even if you think they've doubled it, got it wrong, it's still more than £1,000 for every man, woman, child and baby in this country, or to look at it another way, £4,000 for an ordinary family of 4. And what possible benefits do we get that could justify that? It's been suggested that the single market is a great benefit. We would have to negotiate a free trade agreement if we left. Both the rules of the European Union itself require that, and so do the rules of the World Trade Organization. So I think cost alone means we should leave.
The staff right at the back.
The EU is China's biggest trading partner. Is it therefore time for China to join the EU?
Douglas Hitchens to respond.
I think you make a really, really important point. We're often told that we need market access, and somehow market access comes from signing up to all this architecture of political integration. Last time I walked into Tesco's, I saw lots of product on the shelves made in China, and they're not part of it. You do not need market access to be part of the European Union. Now, we often hear people talk about the single currency, the single market. The single market is not about a common market. It's not about giving us free access to trade. It is about a common set of rules which even businesses in my constituency or any constituency that don't actually do any trade, in fact don't actually export anything at all, have to comply with. It is about giving power to unelected officials, technocrats, to regulate in the nooks and crannies of economic life in this country, and it explains why we are stagnating and why supply-side reform is impossible. I think we need to come out, we need to join that great rush of wealth creation taking place around the world, which by virtue of being locked into this so-called single market, we're denied market access to. But by being outside, we could trade with Europe. We've after all had a trade deficit with Europe for every year since we joined. We could continue to trade with them to their advantage and to ours, and we could open ourselves up to the world. What's there to lose, apart from big corporate vested interests and lobbyists?
Roland, what's there to lose?
Well, I think what's there to lose. To trade effectively with Europe, we have to agree to the one set of rules and regulations we do agree with. We have fed a diet from Peter's newspaper about the problems with straight bananas and bending cucumbers, and the fact that we have to go along with EU rules. The idea that we could come out, trade normally, and we'd agree to what they ask us to do in terms of being able to do that trade is fantasy. They wouldn't, and that would create the sort of the barrier to the trade we get now, and we'd see a huge diminution in that trade the moment we came out of
the extraordinary idea that's being spread here is that the EU is already in some way benevolent to us because we're in it. It's funny, isn't it? It's funny, isn't it, that in Germany all the cars are German, and in France all the cars are French. And the way in which the EU countries continue, apart from us, of course, because we're so communitaire, continue to protect and defend their own markets and industries. The recent events in Derby, the Bombardier contract, are another example of this. The EU does not, because we're in it, offer us very much help. And one of the reasons why so many British businessmen are in favour of being in the EU, apart from the fact that they seem to be incredibly easily led, I remember most of them were in favour of joining the euro as well, is that presumably all the businesses which didn't benefit from EU membership closed down because of EU regulation.
There's lots of other things going. John, right at the back of your mental point, I think, and then there's two questions here.
My name is John Moynihan. I'd like to support very much Stuart Willer's point, but in fact I think all three of the speakers against the motion appear to be saying that the European Union was a frightfully bad thing, but that for some reason or other we should stick with it. The first, Mr. Raab, to me rather surprisingly appeared as a man such as actually confused means with ends. I thought the debate was about whether we should leave or not, primarily about whether we should leave or not. He said, well, we shouldn't leave now because we might lose the vote to leave. No, you decide whether you want to leave or not, and then decide on the ends, or on the means of leaving. That was just basic view. The second one said, it's really important to have an answer to Kissinger's question, who should I call? Well, we all know we have an answer. The answer is Baroness Ashton, if you want. And so the third appeared to say that it was a really bad thing, but we should stay here because we were all 6-year-old children. I thought that was really, to me, a little insulting. I'm at least 8 years old. I want you to know. But finally, they all said that trade with Europe was really important. One said it was 40% of our trade, the other said it was 50% of our trade. I've seen this demolished. I'm not an expert, but we export a lot to Rotterdam, which is the big European port. Then it all goes off to the rest of the world, and that's included in that 40 or 50%. As far as I know. Please can we stop that particular canard, if that's right. But the final point was, he said, oh, well, we shouldn't stay in to negotiate all these financial services, turbine tax, hedge fund, and so forth. It's really important that we do not stay to negotiate those things, but that we be outside the European Union. I'm not a banker, I have nothing to do with banking, but if we agree to negotiate all those things the European way, then we will lose the City of London and this country will be impoverished. The important thing is to be outside, because what will happen is we have different rules. We don't have a Tobin tax and we don't regulate hedge funds the way they're proposing. Then all those foreign exchange traders, all those hedge funds will move to the City of London and our place as the premier financial centre of the world will be assured for decades. And the opposite will be the case if we go along with what the European Union is trying to do with financial services.
one point made about...
Do stand up, please.
There was one point made, I think, at the beginning about the fact that ends and means. Look, my view is very simple. The EU is not perfect, it is very imperfect, it is riddled with flaws. But, nonetheless, whatever we think of it, in the same way as democracy is the least bad option for a country to adopt, we've still got to take a rational cost-benefit analysis of what we want. My view is that a renegotiated relationship, both in relation to the common market, but also lots of other things beyond it, like justice and home affairs, would give us the best of both worlds. I may be wrong on that, but I'm sure about this. Okay, but I'm sure about this. This debate is very much about both ends and means, because if we lose a referendum on the EU, that whole debate and that whole opportunity to repatriate powers is lost for a generation.
But should we leave or not? That's the question. It's not about tactics. It's about what we should be doing.
It is very much about having a strategy and then a set of tactics. I think that the optimum solutions I set out very clearly is a renegotiated relationship. But just to sit in an ivory tower and say, actually, you can't criticise the EU and still want to stay within it or want to reform it, is crazy. Because if we lose a referendum, that opportunity to reform and repatriate powers is lost for a generation.
So you can't criticise the EU without having your career threatened by your party leader.
David Davis.
That seems a good point for me to say something, really, isn't it? I just want to deal with this issue of the costs of being fairly obvious. I want to deal with this issue of the misrepresentation of benefits. Let's take Roland's point about the Indians will not treat us the same as a bloc of 27 countries. Of course they won't. Why should they? But being in the room doesn't mean you get anything more than 1/27th share of that. If that, what you actually get, is the benefit or whatever comes out of a trade negotiation run by a commissioner, and where they choose to put the advantage and the interest. And more often than not, that's not us. Which brings us to the second point about the issue of being in and negotiating our interest. I'll remind you of a few crises down the years, one of which you'll have heard of, the other one you won't. The BSE crisis was half a health scare and half a competitive scam against UK agricultural interest. Full stop. And being in the EU didn't protect us one bit. Remember, they banned us from selling beef to South Africa for South Africa to buy. Another rather more minor one, we've got a big art market. The EU imposed a thing called Droit de Suite, which was deliberately designed as a French operation against the British art market. We could not stop it. And now you see again the Tobin tax being put up, not actually to be implemented, but to be used as a negotiating lever against us in the current negotiations. The idea that being in gives you the sort of advantage the proponents of the notion argue is simply not true. And we should actually balance this properly. We get 1/27th share. If we were Slovenia, that might be worth having. Great Britain, it's not.
It's a question
If, Jeremy Thomas, if perhaps I can apply here Dobson's precept, no, there is no question too outrageous. How far does the anti-European lobby here in Britain tend to use the EU as a scapegoat for Britain's own economic and social inadequacies? When we think of other post-Protestant Northern European societies, both in and out of the euro, the Netherlands, Sweden, Finland, and not least Germany, as we discussed this week, how is it that they have managed to achieve a better record in economic growth, at least in recent years, in their trade position, and also in the control of inflation? I think in 1932, when Harold Macmillan was curiously dabbling with Sir Oswald Mosley, Ralph Butler wrote a letter to the Times saying that when a player complains that the rules of the game are tilted against him, then the fault usually lies more with the player than the game. Should we not, frankly, apply ourselves and try harder, as countries like the Germans, the Dutch, the Finns, and the Swedes have done for generations?
I mentioned that two of the speakers today didn't give a particularly pro-European case for Europe, and I think it tells it because The case of Europe is either that it's inevitable, it's that we're inadequate children, or that we can't manage our own affairs, or it's that it's this idea that reform is just around the corner. Now, on the fact it's inevitable, we've heard a lot about how we'll have to just accept these regulations anyway. Iceland, the government did a study in May 2005, only some 6.5% of EU regulations, directives and decisions had fallen under the EEA agreement over the first 11 years of its existence. Norway, over the period 1997 to 2003, there have been 11,511 pieces of legislation adopted by the EU, which is, I think, a significant fact in itself. Of those, 2,129 fell under the EEA agreement, or about 18.5%. So in both cases, we're talking about well under a fifth of the regulatory decisions which are faced by other countries outside. And at the same time, the idea here that we then lose all voice in this. This treaty is not agreed just in Brussels, then handed down. These countries have extensive vetoes. They don't have things like qualified majority voting deciding these things for them. There is an alternative, and the alternative of hoping for reform. I just think after we had 2 votes against in a referendum when we got Lisbon, and after we had, so I mean, often we sort of joke about the fact that Europe, says vote again until you give the right answer. I think that's it at its most democratic. Other side just says vote and we'll do the opposite of what you said. That's it at its least democratic. And then, or you have after the Eurozone crisis, what we need is more integration. There is just an absolute madness, I think, at this stage, somewhere between naivety and madness. The idea that this great reform of the EU is just around the corner. We can't keep waiting on that delusion to become a reality.
Anthony, then Peter, and then the gentleman in the third row is being incredibly patient.
I'd just like to pick up quite a few different points here. We've got to be careful that we don't try and scapegoat everything on the European Union. And you bring up things like the decline of British car manufacturing, or at least British car marks. And you can't blame that on the European Union. In fact, as it happens, we've got a very big car manufacturing industry now. Most of them are under Japanese names and so on. And the thing is, obviously, we'd still trade with Europe if we left the EU, but in the same way that actually the cost of the EU that people keep pointing out, a lot of that money we would be spending anyway on different things. And for example, we've got the European social funds and regional development funds and so on, that actually we probably will be spending anyway on different projects. It just happens to be circulated around Europe. I don't particularly think it's a good thing to do, but there would be money we'd have to spend to make up for the EU budget. We can't just say it's all a big cost. I just want to paint the alternative university. If the EU didn't exist, it would have to be invented anyway. I mean, 27 a dense patchwork of countries that are very reliant on each other and different things. You'd have 27 different rules and regulations for car manufacturing, toy manufacturing, rules about pollution crossing borders and so on. There would be massive demand for forums. I'm just saying, Labour's point, as Douglas is saying, you wouldn't need it. You wouldn't be able to solve it all with intergovernmentalism. Anyway, the EU's not going to go away, it will carry on existing. If we were outside the EU, this whole debate would be completely reversed. The thing is, we're picking up on all the criticisms of the EU. I agree it's not perfect. We all agree it's not perfect. I think even Roland would agree it's not perfect. We can't just focus on all the bad things. We don't focus on the good things. If we were outside it, there'd be endless stories about the problems of not being in the EU. And I just take some examples of car manufacturing, for example. The EU sets the regulations on car manufacturing, the emissions of cars, and all the different rules and regulations about it. We are around that table, helping set those regulations, making sure that they're in our industries' interest. We still have that interest. If we were outside it, and the French and Germans really were setting car regulations without us being part of it, we'd be endlessly complaining about it. Everyone in this room would have a similar debate saying, well, we should be in the EU, and saying, well, actually, why aren't we around the table? Why aren't we having our say? And so on. And literally, you can't just think about the sort of the current individual little problems that there are. Think about the alternative.
Peter, then the gentleman third.
Very quickly, if you'll forgive me, the point that I was making about car manufacture had nothing to do with the British emergency. I was an industrial correspondent in the late 1970s and early 1980s. I know perfectly what the British car industry committed suicide. I watched it doing it. It's not the point. The point that I was making is that European Union countries protect their own markets through informal and devious measures, despite the supposed existence of a single market, which I think you really ought to acknowledge. It is a truth known to any businessman who operates in Europe. The other problem with the European Union is that it applies regulations. For instance, we have almost no slaughterhouses left in this country because regulations were applied to them for export, which were also applied to slaughterhouses which had no export business because they were EU regulations. This isn't just a trade arrangement; it's an interference with internal national decision making processes over which we have no control, except a 1/27th voice, if that. The point that the gentleman made about blaming the European Union for our problems, I think it's a very good point. The only person, as far as I know, who's using this method is actually the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who isn't here and who would be on that side if he was. There are many, many things which are wrong with this country, and many of them have nothing whatever to do with the European Union, though I would say this. If you trace back the aftermath of the Suez disaster, 1956, Konrad Adenauer spoke. They were having meetings about the consolidation of the European project into a common market at that stage in Paris. And Konrad Adenauer said to François Pinault, who the French being as bruised as we were by the Suez disaster, Europe will be our revenge. And what we must remember is the total demoralization of the governing class of this country, not at the moment, the total demoralization of the governing class of this country in 1956 and afterwards, which affected so many things, from the way we run our education system to the general collapse of authority, which has affected so many other parts of our policy. Yes, Suez may well be to blame, but that demoralization was also to blame for the fantasy that somehow or other we could rescue ourselves and recover our world standing lost through the collapse of empire through joining the European Union. We have tried that idea to destruction. It has brought us nothing of the kind. And I do want to make it quite clear, I do not blame everything that's wrong with this country on the European Union, no. But I do think that if we reasserted ourselves as an independent country with some pride in its past and traditions and abilities, we would have more chance of survival and more chance of prosperity than we do while remaining in this prison house of nations.
Cut you off, I'm afraid. I've got to brutally cut you off because the gentleman in third row is unbelievably professional.
My name is Roland, and I'm qualified consultancy. Can I perhaps, I'm probably one of the few people in the room, I actually voted against joining the European in 1975. My views are perhaps closer to what Hitchens had in the 1970s, but that's another point. But can I raise the horizon a bit further in terms of energy and environment policy, in terms of climate change, for example? UK has a role in terms of negotiation of climate change, in terms of part of the European Union. When the meeting in Durban, for example, is going to take place in 2 or 3 weeks' time. UK on its own will have a zero influence in the issue of climate change and what policies are necessary. And I think perhaps we need to raise our horizons a bit more than just the pure economic costs and benefits. Because in terms of climate and in terms of climate policy, it's important that you have the right policy which don't damage the economy.
Matthew,
this is my area, and you could not be more wrong. The EU is entirely, look at the Copenhagen Accord. The Copenhagen Accord was agreed when the European Union negotiators were not in the room, because we are willing to do whatever is asked of us under any of these summits, and we tend to do it whether or not they're agreed in a summit or not. So the European Union, it drives it in terms of there are lots of people in the European Union who like this, and they argue for it intellectually, for these disastrously expensive and failing policies, like renewable subsidies, for example, which are requiring Britain to invest more this decade, according to Sinclair, than Germany, France, Italy, and Spain put together. This is a classic example of an area where policy formed across the EU has been disastrous for Britain. It is being disastrous for our energy security. Given what they're doing about unconventional oil, for example, coming from Canada, saying the EU is a force for energy security is madness. But like literally, the people who will decide this will be China, India, the United States, because they are the floating vote. Europe is not a vote. Britain is not a floating vote. So yes, we would be irrelevant in these negotiations. We are irrelevant in these negotiations, except as a cheerleader. We stand there with the pom-poms, but we have no greater importance because we're giving the farm away anyway. Because we have a political bloc, partly thanks to the experience of being in the EU, have given up on the idea of representing our national interests. So when the EU emissions trading scheme started, every country set massively excessive quotas for their industry because they could. And as the price collapsed, the scheme was a complete dismal failure, except Britain. And as a fine paper, which I think Neil was involved in, pointed out, that resulted in a huge transfer to other European countries' industries. European energy policy, environment policy, has been a disaster for Britain, and we are far from an effective negotiating voice. We are at best a cheerleader.
Well, just very quickly, and to the gentleman, I agree entirely with what he said, and I think it's a noble ambition to try to reduce your carbon emissions by 20% by 2020.
There was a gentleman in the fourth row, and then we're going to come to the chap in the blue shirt, and then the lady who's standing up. So, gentleman in the fourth row.
Yes, Steve Carr, farmer. Farming is very often raised by farming issues and the fishery issues we've heard quite a bit tonight, particularly by those who wish to leave the European Union. I think because only 1% of the population now are farmers, they feel that they think they can misrepresent agricultural issues and get away with it without fear of being challenged. So we just correct one or two misconceptions. Mr. Davis, I think, raised BSE as some sort of Euro conspiracy against the British beef farmer. I think the USA was the first foreign country to ban British beef. It's close to followed by Australia and most of the Commonwealth. I think the Germans were just about the last country to ban the imports of British beef. But I'd like to just bring it down to perhaps a more prosaic level, mention chickens and pigs. But I think that's a useful metaphor for how the European Union, in terms of a higher ideal, can be thought of. There's a directive due to come in on the 1st of January next year, which will ban the use of barren battery cages for 350 million caged chicken across the European Union. It's going to descend into a farce, undoubtedly, at the beginning of the year, for a period. Despite a 13-year lead-in, half of the chickens will remain in barren battery cages rather than enriched cages on the 1st of January. But there's no reasonable doubt that quite quickly that will be sorted out. And the Commission has said it will be, and it's likely to be pursued, and so it can be sorted out quite quickly. Now, that's the fate of chicken. Now, the alternative would be, say, to quote another example, with pigs, where unilaterally, the UK, passed legislation in 1999 banning the use of sow stalls for pigs. And that was brought in by the end of 1999. Since then, we've seen the UK sow herd shrink by nearly 40%. And that production replaced from imports to Europe and around the world, invariably from sow stalls. So I think that's an example of where only a multinational approach to these issues can stop a rush to the lowest point of production, the lowest set of standards. And I'm not quite so expert on fisheries, but fisheries as usual has been bandied around by those that would leave. And I am familiar, nonetheless, with the term quota hopping, in terms of somehow some sort of dastardly Spanish scheme to rob UK fishermen of their quota. What it actually means is they've sold the quota. The Cornish fishermen have sold their quota to the Spanish fleet, so they can sit in East Lou, drinking their beer, singing Shall Trelawney Live.
You make some interesting points, and I defer to your judgment about the minutiae of pig farming. But I think something that you said actually ties in very nicely with what Jeremy said, which is that we should not blame bad administration when it's homegrown on Europe, and no one's trying to do that. There are many, many things that, as a libertarian, I find offensive about what government is trying to do and the regulations they're trying to bring in. And when we badly regulate and prohibit the creation of wealth in this country, we should recognise that as a problem. I think the problem is that Europe tends to make these sorts of problems a great deal worse. But fundamentally, what we have between the two sides is agreement. We have agreement that Europe, as constituted today, is an uncomfortable place for this country to be in terms of our economic and political and democratic interest. The difference is, to what extent do we believe it can be reformed, and to what extent do we think that we have had enough and should leave? Now, I've spent all my life listening to various politicians and governments promising that they're going to reform. Every single politician I can ever remember, every single government I can ever remember has promised to reform the Common Agricultural Policy. In fact, they promised to reform the Common Agricultural Policy the week after we joined. How's that working out? They promised to reform the common fisheries policy so that it would actually sustain fish stocks and livelihoods. How's that working out? The Lisbon agenda, I'm not talking about the treaty, I'm talking about the Lisbon agenda.
It's been completely transformed beyond recognition from what it was.
And is it working out for the interests of British farmers? I think we should. Yes. I think if we designed an agricultural policy for the interests of British farmers, we could do much better. New Zealand has increased market share without being in the common agricultural policy. I think there are all sorts of things we could do to learn from that. You know, we're often told that Europe is somehow coming our way. I think it was Douglas Hurd who used the famous phrase, the high watermark of federalism. Every single government has talked about how we're winning the argument in Brussels. But it never happens. Subsidiarity, Jacques Delors promised it. It never happens. I think we have to recognise there is only one European club on offer. It may not suit the interests of corporate lobbyists. It may not suit the interests of those who want to shape Europe to deliberate design to the advantage of one particular vested interest, but there's only one Europe on offer. And it is not the decentralised, reformed, open, liberal Europe that we all agree that we want.
Jumping in the very front row.
Samuel Wheeler, no relation to Stuart, at least not as far as I know. All the speakers have talked about repatriation powers through various means. So as the problem is, who are we going to repatriate these powers to? Because both Mr. Hitchens and Mr. Carswell refer to incompetent ministers and incompetent civil servants and corrupt politicians. And so it does seem that we're switching from a group of roads in Brussels to a group of roads in London. The only difference between our interest rates being set by, if we win the euro, between incompetent bankers in Berlin and incompetent bankers in London. Neither of whom are democratically elected, seems rather sort of ephemeral, if you will. I don't really see the difference. But if we have a situation where Tory MPs actually decide that this country should be run for its people, then there's the sense at which they all seem to be for centralisation when it's in their favour. When Scotland and the north of England and Wales suffered for 18 years under Margaret Thatcher because the South East kept voting for the Tories, and pits and steel mills kept closing because inflation was set for the benefit of the citizens of London.
This is why we
I'm not sure any in the Conservative Unionist Party would accept, but the end of your argument is that you should have
it was in the manifesto. It's called localism. Cameron's quite big on it.
There's a lady who's been very patient, standing up at the back. That's you, yes.
Two things. First of all, on Roland's point about the fact that we export more to Ireland, to the single market, than we do to the BRIC countries, I find the intimation that is because the UK has some inherent preference for exporting to the growth devoid countries that make up the single market rather than the BRIC countries, rather misleading. If the UK was free to actually negotiate its own free trade agreements with the BRIC countries, I can assure you, rather than waiting for the EU to drag its feet and do it all on its behalf, I can assure you those exports would be, if not comparable, higher than the single market.
Well, I
don't see any dragging the feet. I mean, if we could do a bilateral arrangement...
FTA been going on?
No, but if we could do a bilateral arrangement, we'd do it straight away. The fact is, as I quoted to you the former Trade Minister from India. He has no reason for saying this, he has no prejudice. He just says simply that India will take it more seriously from 27 than from 1, and I think that's the truth. We tried to do one for South Korea for ages. It was only done by the European Union. It stands to reason, if you're negotiating for so many more people in so many more countries, you have more leverage. I don't understand how Britain can have more leverage on its own.
That only works if we all have the same interests.
Well, we do have the same interests. We want to open up the market.
The entire rest of the EU.
No, of course we do. Every country in the EU wants to open up the market.
They don't believe that.
It's not always full stop from Berlin, Matthew, I promise you. There are nice people there too. They want to open up in Berlin if they do.
If they've all got such united interests, then why does the euro work?
Question right at the back, in the middle, and then a question from the front. Gentleman at the back.
What about energy?
Peter Little from the Agriculture Forum. Isn't the basic dysfunctionalism of the EU
evident in the fact that it couldn't be honest about its motives from the start. Isn't that the problem? That from the very, very start, it had to sell itself as being something that it wasn't. It was always going to be federalist. But in 1975, when we had the chance to vote on it, it was made very clear, in a way which is almost treacherous now, by Heath, that this was nothing to do with political union. So, for example, if I'd been old enough to vote, then I would have voted for it, definitely. And in fact, that was always the reason, that was always the point behind it, was complete political union. They've never come clean about this. So why the hell should anyone believe anything that they say, or indeed that they will reform?
We should believe a word you say, Roland Jones said, this idea of it's all life from the start.
Well, would you like a referendum when Margaret Thatcher signed the Single European Act in '86, which implemented the single market in '87? I mean, that was the greatest pooling of sovereignty, far greater than joining in 1973. Sure. Over here, they would love a referendum and they'd have fought for all the way. But they say that now, but I'm not sure they would have then. But I'd love to know your view, because actually, it was, she did it out of practicality. She did it because it was in Britain's interest. And that's why we're there.
The question, what is your answer? Would you like a referendum?
Well, yes, but I think that well, my point really was that the drift from the very, very beginning was that somehow this was purely a trade arrangement. And it is very, very difficult to disagree with that. I would go along with every trade arrangement. But in fact, underneath that was a political agenda from the very, very start, which they have never been clean about and continue.
It's a gentleman in a red tie right at the start.
I don't what happened. I would setting my sights here. So that big thing about that, and there's endless records of people. I mean, certainly on the other side of the channel, saying this is about, they've got an ultimate aim of but it's not a vision that we've ever held as a country. The thing is, we are actually able to oppose those things, not join the euro, not join, we can opt out of things when we argue for opting out. When we decide what we want in Europe, we've often had a pretty good track record of actually getting it.
Very quickly, Peter, I think you make an absolutely spot-on point. In this country, our EU membership has been legitimised by the political elite, if I can call them that in inverted commas, in terms of economics. Again and again, and we mustn't blame Europe for this, our own political establishment, in its rather ghastly, rotten way, has not been straight with us. They have told us that it's about economic advantage and political price. You only need to look at what's happening in Europe to know that we have been sold EU membership on the basis of a falsehood. It's not in our economic advantage, and which is incidentally why the legitimacy of our membership is now facing crisis, and there is going to have to be a referendum.
Gentleman red tie.
Ronnie Gow, I'm the Chief Executive of Asia House, and I'm interested in these discussions about how we stand out of the Asians. I'm also interested when people talk about chickens and pigs. The chicken, as we know, is involved in the meal. It lays the egg which we consume. It remains in many cases alive. The pig, which is the piece of bacon on the plate, is totally and utterly committed. It can't get out of it. Just a small vignette for you. In Valencia last week, where I was, there was a major conference on China. There were a lot of Chinese people there, chief executives of Chinese companies, and a number of people from continental Europe said if they were not representing Europe as a whole, if they were representing my minor country, which is Spain, said they would not be able to deal with the Chinese. And I think it's very important that we acknowledge that as a fact. I believe that what we're talking about is actually, over many years, a complete dearth of leadership in this country. The reason we're debating this issue about in or out of Europe is because we have failed to get off the touchline and demonstrate the leadership that Winston Churchill and others would have said we should have demonstrated, to instead of letting the Germans and the French run away with this idea and corrupt it, we should be standing up and saying, we will make Europe work. And I commend that to you tonight.
Questions. I'm going to encourage both sides to decide who's going to make their closing statement for each side, so do confer amongst yourselves. But before we do that, there's a gentleman in a blue tie right at the back of the room.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question to the people against the motion. Why would you not subscribe to the idea?
They're not listening to me. Why
would you not subscribe to the idea of a referendum if you're so convinced of your arguments in favour of staying in? And the second question is, if I was in the EU, would you campaign for a referendum to take us out?
Very good. So the two questions there is, if you believe in membership, are you against the referendum? And the second question was
to take us in. I'm sorry.
Oh, you would want and if we were outside the European Union now, would you want a referendum on going in? So are you all referendophiles? I should ask. I mean, do you
against one of
it? Abstain. I'm generally in favour of referendum. I'm not for the EU. I've never had the opportunity, but it's got to be the right question. And I think just coming out with the question in the middle of randomly would be the wrong thing.
So you're not in favour of an in-out referendum now?
Not now, it's out of the blue.
Roland, would you be happy with an in-out referendum?
No, I stand by the fact that the three main political parties in the last general election fought on a very clear commitment to remain within the European Union. And I noticed that UKIP got 3% of the vote, and the three main political parties got the rest, so that's why I'm against.
It's pretty clear answer. There is a question from a gentleman in a red tie there. Maybe we'll make this the last question, I'm afraid.
It's Noel Mance here. I was at the Far East last week, and sterling seems to be rather interesting to Chinese and Korean Malaysian investors again, because Europe's and the euro is seen as a rather difficult area. The gentleman against the motion, do you believe we can continue to negotiate effectively in Europe, being outside the euro?
Sorry? Can we not part of the euro? If we're not in the euro,
we not need to join the euro to be in the middle of Europe.
I think we can effectively negotiate outside the euro. I do, yes. You're against being part of the euro? What do you mean now? I thought you were in favour of being in the euro. No, I'm not campaigning for being in favour of the euro, but I'm very much in favour of the euro succeeding. And I think it's hugely important.
Can I put the question simply? Do you believe your case is sustainable if Britain is not part of the euro?
I do. I do, definitely.
It's a relatively clear answer now. So we're going to go, I'm afraid about time, we're going to go to our summing up. So I'm going to ask the proposers of the motion to give us their brief summing up of the arguments.
Thank you. I think it's me. Anthony Browne, in the course of his interesting argument, refused to take a number of interruptions. The first one of which was when he told the tragic story of his young son who wished to be left alone. I don't know what it is, Anthony, that makes him feel that way. But the question I was going to ask is, how old is the poor child? 6. We see, we are 1,000 years old. We are a major nation with a long history of independence and self-government. We are not a 6-year-old child. And like almost all the metaphors used to gull us into belief that somehow or other we can't manage on our own. We're so small. We're so weak. We're so poor. We're so inexperienced. We're so bad at everything. Look, I am possibly the person who is rudest about this country every week in my column from Hills. And with reason, because I see a country in severe deterioration, but nonetheless I spend a lot of my time travelling to other parts of the world. And I know that despite the many problems which we are bringing upon ourselves and the deterioration which we seem determined to increase, we remain among the freest, best ordered, least corrupt, richest, happiest countries on the surface of the planet. The idea that somehow or other we are unable to negotiate our own trade agreements, to negotiate our own bilateral relations with foreign countries, to prosper on our own in a world in which Norway and Switzerland are able to do so, is as absurd as comparing a country with 1,000 years of free history with a 6-year-old child.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've had a fascinating debate. Peter Hitchens came up and said he wasn't at all xenophobic and he liked the French and the Germans, and I believe him. He happened to write recently, an extraordinary number of the Third Reich's aims and objects of 1939 and 41 seem to have come to pass under the European flag. Anyway, we'll put that to the side. I think there have been a lot of myths that have been put forward by the proponents, and the first is that our trade won't be affected if we left. The interesting thing about the European Union is back in '53 our trade was 13%. It went up to 21% when we entered, and as I mentioned earlier, the actual signing of the Single European Act and creation of the single market took it to 50%. And that's why I think we have to be at the heart of that trading bloc. And just one other thing, very quickly. A number of points were made by the proponents which just need rebutting quickly, that all our regulation comes from the European Union. The Hampton report by Sir Philip Hampton, who is a respected industrialist. I know we had a lot of anti-business rhetoric from this side, but who's a respected industrialist, made that 90% of our regulations came from the UK and not from the European Union. I rest the case that the three main political parties voted actually stood and were voted for with a very clear mandate to remain at the heart of the European Union, and I think our future is dependent on ensuring that we have a liberal and open Europe, and we have to fight for that within the European Union, and we have to get the benefits of those free trade agreements and the energy security while ensuring that our trade is not jeopardized and that there are big issues and big arguments to be made, and we can fight them. And we don't have to be so defeatist and thinking we're always going to lose every argument, because we can win them inside. Thank you.
So now we come to the moment that you've all been waiting for, the key qualified majority vote at the end of this session. So if you have all your high technology pieces of paper to hand, I will ask you to repeat the experiment of earlier on. If you now believe in the proposition, you believe it is now time for Britain to leave the EU, please put your hands or your bits of paper up now.
And if you come up with the wrong answer, you'll have to do it again.
You hold them up, keep them up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11,
Somebody holding a red one.
15, 16, 17, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. And is it 24. And if you oppose, I know, you're not counting speakers, I think we know where you stand. And now those who are opposed to the motions, if you put your hands, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Oops, we're going to kind of get sorry, bad start. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 4. So it's 24, 34. I make it using my very scientific method of counting. We've had a slight change in the demographic within the room during the course of voting, but nonetheless, I'm afraid I declare that the motion is defeated and that the opponents of the motion have it here this evening. We've had a brilliant debate. You've all asked brilliant and informative questions. All of our panelists have been wonderful. Douglas, Dominic, Matthew, Roland, Peter, and Anthony, thank you all so much for your brilliant contributions this evening. Please do, at the end of this discussion, continue. There is wine in the back of the room. Continue the conversation. It is French wine, so you can take that as you will. You can take that as symbol of the benefits of trade and communitary approach, or a desperate attempt to prop up a failing bloc of disastrous economies. But it only really remains for us to thank all of you and our speakers for their brilliant performances this evening. Thank you so much.